It all started with a cold, shocking whisper from my husband, Richard. "After this, I'm moving out. I've already packed. We'll talk later." His words were a bucket of ice water thrown on what should have been the most beautiful moment of our daughter's wedding. As Richard leaned close, his breath warm against my ear, he delivered this devastating news with the same nonchalant tone one might use to discuss dinner plans. This happened as our daughter, Chloe, gracefully walked down the aisle, adorned in her grandmother's pearls. "My name is Eleanor Stone, and I'm 58 years old. For 3 decades, I have been the loyal wife of Richard Stone, meticulously managing our household in Charleston, South Carolina. During this time, he built a reputation as a successful commercial real estate developer. This day was meant to be the pinnacle of all the work we had put in together. Our only daughter was marrying the love of her life in the garden of our historic antebellum home. 300 guests were present to celebrate this special milestone with us. I kept my composure, holding a small bouquet of white roses with steady hands. "Of course, dear," I whispered back, a calmness in my voice that betrayed the utter shock coursing through my veins. Richard adjusted his tie and returned his attention to the ceremony, seemingly content that he had dropped his bombshell without causing a scene. 3 rows behind us, I spotted her, Julia Miller, his 28-year-old secretary. She sat poised in a navy dress, which I now realized was far too expensive for a person of her salary. For 2 years, she had been an employee at Bright Hollow Development, and I had always found her to be pleasant and professional during the few company events where we met. How foolish I had been! While Chloe and Benjamin exchanged vows under the magnolia trees, uttering words about commitment and faithfulness that now felt like a cruel joke, I maintained my tranquil facade. The photographer captured picture-perfect moments, Richard and I standing together, wearing proud smiles as our daughter promised to love and honor her new husband. To all who watched, we appeared to be the quintessential example of marital success, a couple who had endured 30 years together and emerged stronger. However, a cold and calculated resolve had begun to form deep within me. Richard had chosen this moment, our daughter's wedding, to announce his betrayal. He had waited until I was trapped in a public setting, surrounded by friends and family, knowing that any emotional outburst would ruin Chloe's perfect day. He believed he had cornered me, forcing me into silent acceptance of his decision. But what Richard did not know was that I had anticipated this for many months and had been preparing for it. The first hints of trouble had appeared about 6 months earlier, though I had initially dismissed them as a bout of midlife restlessness. Richard began working later, claiming urgent projects required him to have evening meetings. His phone, which he once left carelessly on kitchen counters, was now always in his possession. He had also updated his wardrobe without a word, swapping his comfortable khakis for tailored suits that made him look younger and more vibrant. Our relationship had never been a Hollywood romance, but it had always been stable and comfortable. We had built Bright Hollow Development together, though Richard received all of the public credit. I had managed the financial side of the business from behind the scenes. To support his dreams, I had put my own aspirations of becoming a certified public accountant on hold. Instead, I managed our investments, handled estate planning, and developed tax strategies while he charmed clients and finalized deals. For 3 decades, I had been the perfect wife. I hosted dinner parties for potential investors, managed our household staff, coordinated family vacations, and made sure Richard never had to worry about small details like paying bills or renewing insurance policies. I had raised Chloe while he was away, celebrated his achievements while minimizing my own contributions, and managed our social calendar with military precision. But something changed after Chloe's engagement was announced last year. Richard became distant and distracted. At dinner, he would stare at his phone, claiming to be reading industry news, even though I could see the reflection of text messages in his wine glass. He stopped referring to Julia by name when discussing office matters, only calling her my assistant with a careful neutrality that immediately raised my suspicions. 3 months ago, I began my own investigation. It started small. I checked our joint credit card statements more closely and noticed charges at restaurants I had never visited and boutiques that sold women's clothes in sizes much smaller than mine. I also uncovered a second cell phone bill, paid from an account I had never seen before. When Richard claimed he was attending a real estate conference in Atlanta, I found out the event had been canceled 2 months earlier. That's when I hired Sarah Ellis, a private investigator recommended by my longtime attorney, George Thompson. Sarah was thorough and discreet, providing me with photographs, financial records, and a timeline that painted a clear picture of Richard's affair. Julia Miller was more than just a secretary. She was his mistress, his confidant, and apparently his planned future. The apartment lease Sarah uncovered was particularly revealing. Richard had signed a 1-year contract for a luxury condo downtown, listing himself and Julia as the occupants. The security deposit for the apartment was paid from a business account he had opened without my knowledge, funded by money he had systematically transferred from our joint investments. As I watched Chloe dance with Benjamin during the reception, twirling in circles of ivory silk while the guests applauded, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Richard had completely underestimated me. He saw me as a passive wife who would always accommodate his needs, never questioning his decisions or challenging his authority. He had no idea what I was capable of when properly motivated. The final revelation that shattered my remaining illusions came just 2 weeks before Chloe's wedding. During my routine review of our financial statements, I came across some unusual transfers. Large sums of money had been moved from our joint accounts into an investment fund I didn't know about. I immediately called our financial advisor, Rebecca Davis, who seemed surprised by my inquiry. "I assumed you knew about the new portfolio Richard established," she said, a note of concern in her voice. "He specifically asked for all the documents to be sent to his office address." That same evening, I confronted Richard. He was in his study, looking over contracts, when I placed the printouts of the unauthorized transfers on his desk. For a brief second, his composed demeanor faltered, revealing genuine surprise. "Eleanor, these are just business investments," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I'm diversifying our holdings to protect our retirement." "Our retirement?" I questioned, keeping my tone calm and professional. "These transfers are going to accounts that only have your name on them, and Rebecca confirmed that you instructed her to exclude me from all communication regarding these investments." Richard stood up and walked to the window, looking out at our garden. "You have always trusted me to handle the financial decisions. Why are you questioning me now?" he asked. "Because this isn't just handling finances," I countered. "This is hiding assets." I watched his shoulders, tense as the truth settled between us. "I know about Julia, Richard. I know about the apartment, the secret phone, all of it." He turned around slowly. For the first time in our 30-year marriage, he looked like a complete stranger. The man I had loved and supported for 3 decades now viewed me with a cold, calculated stare, assessing how much damage control he would need to perform. "What do you want?" he asked in a low voice. "I want honesty," I replied, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "I want to know how long you have been planning to leave and why you are stealing from our joint accounts to fund your new life." Richard straightened his tie, instantly becoming the shrewd businessman he was. "I am not stealing anything," he stated. "Those funds represent my contribution to our marriage, and I have every right to protect my interests." "Your interests?" I said, astonished by his nerve. "I have been managing our finances for 3 decades. I know precisely what each of us contributed, and it is not what you think." That's when I saw the first hint of uncertainty flicker in his eyes. Richard had always believed I simply paid bills and balanced checkbooks, never grasping the intricate web of investments, trusts, and legal protections I had woven around our assets. He had never bothered to understand the complexity of our financial structure because he never thought he would have to. As I left to study that night, I knew our marriage was over. However, I also knew that Richard had made a fatal error. He had completely underestimated the woman who had been quietly safeguarding and growing our wealth for 30 years. The weeks leading up to Chloe's wedding became a careful dance of deception from both of us. Richard continued his act as the dedicated father, enthusiastically discussing reception details and guest arrangements while secretly finalizing his exit strategy. Meanwhile, I played the part of the overwhelmed mother of the bride, using wedding preparations as a pretext for meetings with my attorney, George Thompson. For 15 years, George had been our family lawyer, but this was the first time I had met with him alone. His office overlooked Charleston Harbor, and as he reviewed the evidence Sarah Ellis had gathered, I found myself staring at the sailboats in the distance. "Eleanor, what Richard has done is considered marital misconduct under South Carolina law," George explained, spreading photographs and financial documents across his mahogany desk. The secret transfers, the hidden apartment lease, the systematic depletion of joint assets, all of this supports your position in divorce proceedings. But I was not interested in a lengthy court battle that would inevitably become a public spectacle. Richard's real estate empire relied on his reputation as a trustworthy family man and community leader. I do not want to destroy him publicly, I told George. I want him to destroy himself. That's when we developed what George privately called the surgical approach. Instead of contesting Richard's asset transfers, we would let him continue making them while ensuring he was actually transferring money he no longer legally owned. The key was to restructure our holdings before he realized what was happening. Over the next 10 days, I signed documents that moved the majority of our assets, our family home, the vacation house on Kiowa Island, the investment properties that generated our rental income, into irrevocable trusts, protected investment accounts, and legal entities that Richard could not access without my explicit consent. Everything was quietly shifted into structures that safeguarded my interests while leaving Richard's recent transfers as clear evidence of attempted fraud. The most satisfying discovery came when Sarah uncovered the full extent of Richard's financial scheming. He had been methodically moving money for months, convinced he was securing his future with Julia. What he failed to realize was that most of the accounts he had been funding were linked to assets I had already legally protected through the restructuring process. Your husband has essentially been stealing his own money and giving it to his mistress, Sarah explained with professional satisfaction. When the divorce proceedings begin, those transfers will be viewed as dissipation of marital assets, which means he will be required to reimburse the marital estate. Richard's confidence in those final weeks before the wedding was almost comical. He would come home from his secret meetings with Julia looking smug, likely imagining how smoothly his new life would begin. He had established a new life, secured his finances, and timed his announcement to minimize my ability to interfere. At Chloe's rehearsal dinner, I watched him give a heartfelt speech about love, commitment, and the importance of family. He spoke eloquently about the marriage he and I had built, praising my dedication and support while guests applauded his apparent devotion. Later, I saw him check his phone multiple times, likely coordinating the final details with Julia about their post-wedding plans. In a cruel twist of fate, Richard was celebrating what he believed to be his liberation, oblivious to the fact that he was actually orchestrating his own downfall. Just 2 days prior to the wedding, I put the final parts of my plan into place. I had already placed copies of all our financial documents, conclusive proof of Richard's affair, and a meticulously detailed timeline of his asset transfers in a downtown safety deposit box. Additionally, I had also put the divorce papers prepared by George inside, along with a full accounting of all our assets. This list was sure to be a shock to Richard, as he would finally grasp the full extent of his miscalculation. On the morning of Chloe's wedding, I woke up before the sun had risen to go over everything one final time. In just a few hours, Richard would make his carefully planned announcement, thinking he held every single advantage. He had no clue that I had been getting ready for this exact moment for several months, that every single move he had made had been predicted and skillfully countered. The wedding ceremony went off without a hitch, despite Richard's terrible secret whispered in my ear. Chloe was absolutely glowing as she promised to love Benjamin through any hardship life might throw at them, and their promises felt almost prophetic given the intense drama unfolding in the front row. I managed to remain composed all through the service, smiling at all the right times and dabbing my eyes with a handkerchief when Chloe's voice cracked with emotion during her vows. After the ceremony, the photo session became an unreal exercise in false appearances. Richard and I posed together for family portraits, with his arm around my waist, as if nothing had changed between us. When the photographer asked for a picture of just the parents, Richard smiled warmly and pulled me closer, playing his part as the dedicated husband flawlessly. "Beautiful ceremony," Julia remarked as she came up to us during the cocktail hour, her voice carefully neutral. "Chloe looks absolutely stunning." "Thank you," I replied pleasantly, noticing how Richard's jaw tightened slightly when she spoke. "We're so proud of her." The three of us stood there for a moment, forming an awkward triangle of civility that barely hid the explosive truth underneath. Julia quickly excused herself, likely sensing a tension she couldn't quite put her finger on. During the dinner, Richard delivered yet another performance that deserved an award. He stood to give the traditional father speech, his voice strong and filled with emotion as he spoke about watching Chloe grow up and the pride he felt in the woman she had become. He publicly thanked me for being the heart of our family and the woman who had made it all possible. The applause was deafening, and several guests came up to me afterward to comment on what a wonderful marriage we had and how lucky Chloe was to have parents who clearly adored each other after so many years. Each compliment felt like a small knife, but I smiled graciously and accepted their praise while secretly planning his downfall. As the evening went on, I noticed Richard checking his watch repeatedly. He had probably promised Julia they would leave together once the reception wrapped up, finally beginning their new life as a couple. Every few minutes, his eyes would find her across the room, and I could see the anticipation building in his expression. The moment I had been waiting for arrived during the last dance. While Chloe and Benjamin swayed to their wedding song, surrounded by loved ones who had gathered to celebrate their love, Richard leaned close to me again. "I know this is difficult," he said quietly, "but I think it's better this way. A clean break, no prolonged arguments or negotiations." "I agree completely," I replied, my voice steady. "A clean break is exactly what we need." Richard looked surprised by my calm response, likely expecting tears or a pleas for a change of heart. "I'm glad you understand. I was worried you might make this complicated." "Oh, Richard," I said softly, turning to meet his eyes directly. "I would never make things complicated for you." Something in my tone must have clicked, because his confident expression flickered slightly. But before he could respond, Chloe and Benjamin approached us, glowing with happiness and ready to begin their honeymoon departure tradition. As we waved goodbye to the newlyweds, Richard standing beside me with rice in his hair and his arm around my shoulders for the final photographs, I felt a sense of completion. Chloe was safely married and heading for her honeymoon in Italy. The guests were beginning to depart, thanking us for a beautiful celebration, and Richard was about to discover that his carefully orchestrated escape plan had been an elaborate trap of his own making. After the very last guest had left and the catering staff finished cleaning up, Richard and I found ourselves alone in our garden for the first time since his announcement that morning. He had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, looking relaxed and pleased with how smoothly the day had gone. "That went well," he said, surveying the remnants of Chloe's reception. "She looked happy." "She did," I agreed, then turned to face him directly. "I believe you mentioned we needed to talk." Richard's expression became more serious as he prepared for what he clearly expected to be a difficult but manageable conversation. "Eleanor, I know this comes as a shock, but I think if we handle this maturely, we can minimize the disruption for everyone involved." "I appreciate your concern for minimizing disruption," I said, reaching into my small evening purse to pull out a manila envelope I had carried with me all through the entire wedding. "I've prepared something that should help with that." Richard looked puzzled as I handed him the envelope. "What's this?" "Everything you'll need for your fresh start," I replied calmly, "including some documents I think you should review immediately." His confusion deepened as he opened the envelope and began examining the contents. I watched his face carefully, noting the exact moment when his confidence began to crack. It started with a small frown as he read the very first page, then became genuine alarm as he flipped through the divorce papers George had prepared. "This is dated 3 weeks ago," Richard said slowly, his voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty I had heard from him all day. "Yes, I filed them the day after I discovered your secret apartment lease," I explained pleasantly. "Keep reading. The asset list is particularly interesting." Richard's hands were shaking slightly as he reached the financial documentation. I had included copies of every transfer he had made, every hidden account he had opened, and every single penny he had moved to fund his new life with Julia. But even more importantly, I had included the legal documents showing how those assets had been restructured months before his transfers had even started. "You cannot do this," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "The accounts, these investments, I created them. The money came from our shared assets." "Actually, Richard," I countered, my voice calm, "if you look more closely at the dates, you will see that I reorganized our holdings long before you started your unauthorized transfers." I kept my tone easy, as though we were talking about gardening rather than his financial ruin. The money you have been moving for the past 6 months is funds you no longer had legal access to. As the implications sank in, the color drained from his face. The house, the business accounts, the investment properties, everything was protected by irrevocable trusts and legal entities that required my consent for any transactions. I watched him frantically search through the documents, hoping to find a loophole or some kind of mistake. Your transfers to Julia's accounts are considered fraud under South Carolina law. George has already submitted the necessary paperwork with the district attorney's office. Richard looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before, genuine fear mixed with the dawning realization of how completely he had been outmaneuvered. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Long enough to secure my assets properly," I replied. "Long enough to ensure your betrayal could not ruin what I have spent 30 years building." For a moment, we stood in silence amidst the scattered rose petals and empty champagne flutes, the wreckage of Chloe's perfect wedding, now the backdrop to the end of our marriage. Richard's panic was immediate and absolute. Standing among the remnants of our daughter's wedding reception, he clutched the divorce papers as his entire world crumbled around him. The self-assured man who had whispered his escape plan during Chloe's ceremony was gone, replaced by someone desperate and cornered. "Eleanor, please," he said, his voice cracking. "We can work this out. I will cancel the apartment. I will end things with Julia. We do not have to destroy everything we have built." I looked at him with genuine pity. Even now, facing the complete collapse of his plans, Richard still failed to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. He believed this was about jealousy or hurt pride, something that could be fixed with apologies and promises. "Richard, you chose to end our marriage the moment you whispered your announcement during our daughter's wedding ceremony," I said quietly. "You chose to take from our joint accounts to finance your affair. You chose to hide assets and plan your future with no consideration for the woman who spent 30 years supporting your ambitions." His hands shook as he looked through the financial documents once more, likely hoping he had misinterpreted something vital. "The business, our reputation. If this becomes public, it will destroy everything." "It does not have to become public," I responded. "If you sign the divorce agreement and cooperate with the asset recovery process, we can handle this discreetly. But if you choose to fight these proceedings, every single detail of your affair and financial misconduct will become part of the public record." Richard's face went pale as the full scope of his predicament became clear. He had planned his escape so meticulously, but he had never anticipated that his quiet, supportive wife might be devising her own counter-strategy. The woman he had taken for granted for 3 decades had systematically dismantled his future while graciously smiling at wedding guests. "How did you know?" he asked in desperation. "I have always known who you truly are, Richard," I said with finality. "The question is whether you are going to accept responsibility for your choices or make this even uglier than it needs to be." The aftermath unfolded exactly as George had predicted. By Monday morning, Richard discovered that his access to every significant account had been terminated. The business credit cards he had used for his secret transactions were canceled. The investment portfolios he had been counting on were legally protected, and the apartment he had leased for himself and Julia was under investigation for fraudulently obtained funds. That same week, Julia Miller resigned from Bright Hollow Development, likely realizing that her connection to Richard had become a professional liability. The private investigator, Sarah, had thoroughly documented their relationship, creating a trail of evidence that would make any future employment in Charleston's tight-knit business community extremely difficult. Richard tried to salvage his situation by contacting our mutual friends and business associates, hoping to gain sympathy for his position. However, word of his affair and financial misconduct quickly spread through Charleston's social circles, and the man who had built his reputation on trustworthiness found himself increasingly isolated. The fraud investigation George had initiated proceeded methodically. Richard's unauthorized transfers were easily documented, and his attempts to hide assets actually strengthened the case against him. Within 2 weeks, he was facing potential criminal charges in addition to the civil proceedings. Meanwhile, I maintained my dignity throughout the process. I attended Chloe's post-wedding brunch as planned, graciously accepting congratulations from friends who had not yet heard about Richard's departure. When asked about his absence, I simply explained that he was handling urgent business matters. The irony was not lost on me. After 3 decades of supporting Richard's career and reputation, I was now the one protecting the family name while he was in the process of destroying everything he had claimed to value. His carefully planned escape had become a public humiliation that would follow him for years. By the time Chloe came back from her honeymoon, Richard had quietly settled the divorce agreement rather than face a public trial that would have exposed every detail of his betrayal. As I sit in my garden 6 months later, watching the magnolias bloom where Chloe danced on her wedding day, I realized that Richard's betrayal was actually a gift. It freed me to discover my own strength and independence after living for decades in someone else's shadow. Sometimes, the most devastating betrayals become the foundation for our greatest victories.